Imagine a king. He appears on the battlefield in full royal regalia, behind him tens of thousands of armored soldiers. He outnumbers the enemy 3-1. He's fighting on home turf. On paper, he can't lose. But there's one thing he doesn't know. Half the nobles at his back are quietly praying for him to go down. Mid-battle, his own men start peeling off and walking away. In the end, his body is never found. Some say he drowned in a river, others that enemy cavalry cut him down. How does a man who was supposed to win lose an entire kingdom and himself in one afternoon? The answer isn't in swords, it's in the faces behind him, the ones who wanted him dead. Forget the date for a moment, look at one gesture. A man stands beneath a red-walled palace and hands over a set of keys. No sword drawn, no self-immolation, no war cries. He just hands over the city gates. That man is Muhammad. I. The Spaniards later called him Boabdil, the last Muslim monarch on this soil. The palace is the Alhambra. The year is 1492. With that exchange of keys, a story that would later be counted as 781 years long gets stamped with a single word: finished. But here's the catch, my friend, and it's a big one. A key can only be handed over if, over the centuries, it's been grabbed, lost, melted down, and reforged countless times. Today we're not going to tell you Christians won in the end. That's a slogan printed on textbook covers. Neat and suspicious. We're going to count a different ledger. How many hands did that key actually pass through? And what were those people afraid of and forced to do every time they passed it? Let me be blunt from the start. On this subject, we are not neutral, and we can't be. The very word Reconquista was invented centuries later, tailor-made to tell a tidy story. The real history is far messier, far stickier. We will try to scrape off a little of that later applied gold paint. Now shrink the stage to its smallest size. Don't memorize the place names yet. First, see what kind of trouble was already lying on this ground. At the beginning of the 8th century, the Iberian Peninsula, today's Spain and Portugal, was officially ruled by a Christian kingdom called the Visigoths. It looked the part: king, taxes, cities, but if you peered into the seams, you'd see it was held together with personal grudges as glue. The nobles were drowning in old scores. Kingship never rested on divine right, but on who's got the bigger fist this round. Such a kingdom looks fine in peacetime, but the moment an outside wind blows, it cracks from within. To its north sat the Franks, the big block in Gaul. They'd fought before, and the Franks had even killed a Visigothic king on the battlefield. The fighting stopped, but the grudge didn't, which in plain English meant when push came to shove, those two would never lend each other a hand. Now look south across the strait. That was a completely different weight class. On the Moroccan side stood the Umayyad Caliphate. Please don't file it under yet another Islamic warlord clique. It was the biggest superpower of its time, stretching from the Atlantic all the way to the Persian highlands, with its capital in Damascus. How did this behemoth grow? It started with the lightning conquests launched by the Prophet Muhammad, and over decades it turned from a faith-driven movement into an empire machine through expansion, infighting, and betrayal. By the early 8th century, that machine was staring across North Africa. And here enter the first people caught in its gears. For Jaim, the Berbers, the Arab armies pushed west, forcing local Berber tribes to convert and submit. Many Berbers accepted Islam and squeezed into the new order. But squeezing in didn't mean standing equal. In the eyes of the Arab governors, Berbers were second-class Muslims, useful, expendable, far from Damascus, and no one would mourn however many of them died. Remember that fault line. It wasn't dug by some particular villain. It was simply how the machine worked. Use the lives on the margins to feed the center's expansion. That crack would come back to bite, again and again. Now the North African governor, Musa, had tens of thousands of new recruits under his hand. More troops, good, right? That was exactly his headache. Those Berber recruits had been promised glory, loot, and spiritual reward. What did they get? Grinding skirmishes against mountain guerrillas, dirty, poor, and loot-free. An army that's been promised a feast and served leftovers is a ticking bomb. It will either mutiny, or it needs an outlet. So Musa looked across the strait and saw that gilded but rotten Visigothic kingdom on the other side. Let's pause on one word here because it carries far too much baggage today. The Umayyads believed they had a sacred duty to push Islam into every land not yet under God's rule. That duty had a name: jihad. Today that word is wrapped in politics and fear, but back then its literal meaning was struggle or holy war, spread the faith, extend the order, bring non-Muslims into submission. But to be fair, of course a Christian kingdom would panic when it heard its neighbor calling conquest a sacred obligation. The problem is, at that time, half the Mediterranean world, on the Christian side too, was using exactly the same logic to invoice its own conquests. Sacred obligation was never a monopoly of one faith. It was the fuel all expansion machines ran on. So you see, the crossing wasn't some fanatic's brainstorm. It was an army needing an outlet, the simmering Berbers, plus a governor needing a win, Musa, plus a ready-made religious justification, jihad, plus a prey already cracked open on the other shore. All those forces twisted together to push the boats into the water. In 711, a Berber commander led about 7,000 men across that narrow strait. His name was Tariq ibn Ziyad. His fleet landed at a cliff that would later bear his name, Jabal Tariq, the mountain of Tariq, which we call Gibraltar today. Here's a detail that punctures the neat holy war vs infidel narrative. Tariq's army moved fast and well supplied, largely because a Christian nobleman fed them. That nobleman had a personal grudge against the reigning and deeply contested King Roderick, so he turned around and handed the invaders weapons, grain, and horses. See it? The first holy warriors to land were fattened up by a Christian with a score to settle. This war was never two religions clashing from day one. It was a bunch of people with their own agendas using faith as a flag. Legend has it that Tariq burned his ships as soon as he landed and shouted to his men, "Behind you is the sea, before you the enemy. You have only faith and your swords." Historians aren't sure he ever said that. It's exactly the kind of no-retreat line that's too good not to insert into a hero script later. But looking at what happened next, he did put himself in a position where turning back wasn't an option. That was the first irreversible choice in this story. Once the ships burned, the strait went from escape route to a wall. North, King Roderick was busy with something he thought was more important. His real problem wasn't sails on the southern horizon, it was his own legitimacy. Half the Visigothic nobles hated him, and the other half hadn't decided if he counted as a proper king. When the urgent dispatches from the south piled up on his desk, he couldn't pretend anymore, so he fell back on the oldest trick in the book: muster a huge army, march down, win, go home, and force everyone to shut up and accept him as the true king. The two armies met at a river in the southern part of the kingdom. On one side, Roderick's Visigothic host, thousands of armored warriors, nobles, and peasant levies all under the cross. On the other, the Umayyad force, much smaller, lighter armored, mostly Berbers who'd been told, "This is your chance to prove yourselves before God, and grab a city or two while you're at it." This should have been an easy fight. The Visigoths had numbers, home advantage, and a king so confident he showed up in full ceremonial robes. But my friend, numbers don't mean a thing when politics isn't on your side. Remember those nobles who hated their king? According to the chronicles, in the middle of the battle some noble contingents switched sides on the spot. Others simply pulled out. The Christian side dissolved into chaos. Roderick's command chain snapped. And the result you can guess: that outnumbered little force turned around and smashed the Visigothic army to pieces. Roderick's body was never found. Some say he drowned in the river, others that cavalry hacked him apart. The outcome was the same. The king was gone, and so was the kingdom that had limped along for 3 centuries. Now let me slam the brakes here and warn you against the favorite mistake in this lane. Don't say Tariq conquered the Visigothic kingdom. Tariq won a battle. What really killed that kingdom was itself, the internal noble structure that tore it apart, the legitimacy that nobody would die for. The foreign sword just stabbed into a crack that had been there all along. Tariq himself hadn't expected such a victory. He kept pushing north. Within months, Córdoba, Granada, even the capital Toledo fell. Cities that surrendered were spared, then heavily taxed. Cities that resisted, well, let's not dwell. For ordinary townsfolk, this so-called war of faith translated into one thing: a new tax collector. Pay and live, refuse and suffer. Holy or not holy was abstract. The tax bill was real. Governor Musa, hearing that his subordinate had gobbled up an entire kingdom, turned green with envy. This had only been a reconnaissance mission. He quickly raised his own force and crossed north, half to claim his share, half to stop Damascus from treating his deputy as Islam's new hero. See? Even the winners were fighting over credit. Pure holy war? No, this was office politics. By 718, only 7 years after the landing, almost the entire peninsula was under Muslim rule. They gave it a new name, al-Andalus. If you think, Okay, Muslims took over, Christians sat around waiting for a comeback. Then you've just fallen into that carefully polished narrative trap. The truth is, for centuries afterward, it was never an uninterrupted all-out religious war. 8 generations of people can't spend every day stabbing each other. There were marriages, alliances, mercenary deals, coexistence, and a whole lot of enemies who actually sat down at the same dinner table. First look south. Al-Andalus didn't rot into ruins, it thrived. New cities rose from Roman rubble, the broken Visigothic order was replaced by a sophisticated Arab administration, and most importantly, trade exploded. This land connected to the entire Islamic world's wealth network, and for the first time in centuries, it got rich. Later, under the Emirate of Córdoba, most Andalus became one of the most advanced societies in Europe. Parties that made everything north of the Pyrenees look shabby: irrigation, citrus, algebra, architecture, you name it. Christian scholars even traveled south to study Arabic philosophy and, probably, to taste something other than salted pork. Now look at the myth of continuous resistance in the north. After the peninsula fell, a few Christian holdouts remained in the northern mountains. In those fog-filled valleys, a legend began to take shape. The Visigothic Christians weren't defeated, they're just waiting. Waiting for the Reconquista. Al-Andalus's governors were busy carving up their newly won spoils. Who had time for a bunch of ragged shepherds in the hills? What could a few hundred half-starved goatherds do to the caliph's empire? But then the unexpected happened. In the rugged mountains of Asturias, a man named Pelagius refused to submit. Whether he was a Visigothic noble or a local warlord depends on who you ask. He watched his kingdom fall, his peers betray, his churches burn, and he settled on one thing. He wasn't going to pay taxes to the newcomers. So he scraped together a few hundred men, veterans, stubborn peasants, monks, anyone who could swing a sword, and disappeared into the high country. That tiny resistance became the seed of something new, the Kingdom of Asturias. Calling it a kingdom is generous. It was more like a few huts, a church, and an overly optimistic cave. But it was independent. And independence, in Umayyad eyes, meant danger. So they sent a small force north to clean it up, expecting a routine tax collection day. That force marched into Covadonga, a narrow gorge with cliffs on both sides. Pelagius and his men were hidden in the blind spots, waiting. When the enemy was deep enough, rocks, arrows, and every early Spanish curse you can imagine rained down from above. The terrain turned the fight into a one-sided slaughter. The man nobody took seriously had just won the first Christian victory in Muslim Spain. But don't get carried away with the later propaganda. That battle probably killed a few hundred people and moved no map lines. Its real effect was to keep alive the legend of Christians in the hills. Maybe, just maybe, the caliph's empire wasn't unbreakable. Many later historians would mark Covadonga as the official start of the Reconquista, but that starting line was drawn long after the fact. Pressed in time, nobody thought they were starting a 781-year relay race. So the continuous resistance is at its core a story that was needed. Every hill retaken, every valley recovered was written into the sacred narrative as proof that God is still on our side. The narrative ran first. The facts slowly caught up. So why did that seed eventually grow into a tree? Not because Pelagius was so great, but because his opponents started imploding. In 750, far away in Damascus, the Umayyad Caliphate, the giant from Spain to India, was overthrown by a rival family, the Abbasids, in a bloodbath. The new rulers moved the capital east to Baghdad, effectively abandoning Al-Andalus as a distant province. One Umayyad prince, Abd al-Rahman, escaped the massacre, fled for months, crossed the Mediterranean, and landed in Spain, figuring, people here were loyal to the Umayyads anyway, so let's start over. In 756 he declared himself Emir of Córdoba, setting up an independent Muslim state that owed allegiance to no one. Just like that, Al-Andalus went from a far-flung colony to a self-sustaining power. Later, under Abd al-Rahman II, in 929, he went a step further. He proclaimed himself Caliph of Córdoba, putting himself on equal footing with Baghdad. But every golden age has its cracks. The prosperity of this caliphate rested on a fragile cooperation. Arab elites, Berber soldiers, local converts, Jewish administrators all had to work together. And the Iberian Peninsula's least favorite pastime was exactly that, cooperation. When a strong man died, the system wobbled. In 1009, Córdoba plunged into a Muslim civil war that tore the caliphate apart. In less than 20 years, al-Andalus shattered into dozens of petty, mutually hostile city-states, known as the taifas. The south was tearing itself apart, the north smelled blood, the Christian states by now grown from Asturias into Leon, Castile, Navarre and Aragon began pushing south. Again, don't get swept up in epic narratives. This wasn't a steamroller. It was a slow grind that lasted centuries. One long grinding chess match of raids, sieges, marriages and betrayals. The Christians were actually fine with it being slow, because their greatest ally at the time was time itself. Here's a detail so absurd it makes you laugh, but you're laughing at power itself. Those Taifa mini-states fought not only the north, but each other. Every ruler wanted to be the next caliph. Every city wanted to outshine Cordoba's old glory. So when things got hot, some Muslim rulers did the most counterintuitive thing. They hired Christian kings to protect them. Yes, they paid salaries to the very armies that prayed daily for their destruction. See it? The Crescent vs. Cross framework falls apart completely here. The real logic was naked self-interest and survival. Whoever keeps me alive is my ally, creed be damned. By the 1080s, the balance began to tilt heavily one way. Castile rose under King Alfonso V, and in 1085 he took Toledo, the old Visigothic capital. That one was different. The first major city to be recaptured, a signal that boomed like a church bell. The Reconquista was no longer a legend, it was happening. The Taifas in the south panicked, and they called for help across the strait. So they did the only thing they could. They invited in someone even nastier. In came the Almoravids, a hardline Berber Muslim dynasty from North Africa. They wore veils, rode camels, preached strict Islamic law, and crossed the Strait of Gibraltar just like the Umayyads 3 centuries earlier. Only this time they came to save al-Andalus, not conquer it. For Badiyat, at first it worked. In 1086, the Almoravids smashed Alfonso V at the Battle of Sagrajas, slamming the brakes on Christian expansion for an entire generation. But I'm going to sound like a broken record now. On the Iberian Peninsula, power corrodes fast. Decades later, the Almoravids went soft, fractured, lost their edge, and soon it was their turn to call for help. In came an even stricter movement, the Almohads, so hardcore they made the Almoravids look like hippies. The Almohads rebuilt the south, enforced a Puritan Islam and marched north again, handing the Christians a serious slap at Alarcos in 1195. For a moment, history seemed about to repeat. The cross looked like it might shatter against the Crescent once more, but then came 1212. In a rare moment of Christian unity, Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and even crusaders from France came together, meeting the Almohad host at Las Navas de Tolosa in the heart of Al-Andalus. That battle was brutal, chaotic, decisive. Scholars often call it the clash of two faiths. The Christian coalition punched through the enemy camp and smashed that army to pieces. Notice the thread I buried earlier. The Christians could win this one only because they were for once united. And why did the South keep losing? Largely because it never truly united. Taifa infighting, outside dynasties that overstayed their welcome, waves of invaders who themselves softened and split. Crediting some brilliant king or holy victory for all of that is lazy thinking. What really drove the result was the internal cohesion of each side, who could hold together just a few years longer. The following century, the Christians rolled south. Cordoba, Valencia, Seville, one by one they fell. By the mid-13th century, Muslim Spain was almost gone. Almost, one piece remained. Granada, huddled at the foot of the Sierra Nevada, was Al-Andalus's last jewel, small, wealthy, and cunning, surviving on diplomacy. Its Nasrid rulers paid tribute to Castile, married daughters into Christian courts and kept the Reconquista at bay for another 2 centuries by walking a tightrope. 2 centuries on a tightrope, but ropes fray. By the end of the 15th century, the Christian kingdoms had merged under Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the famous Catholic monarchs. Their marriage had welded Spain into a superpower, and Granada was the last item on the checklist. In 1482, the monarchs launched a decade-long war to finish what Pelagius was said to have started 7 centuries earlier. Fortress by fortress, valley by valley, the noose tightened. And so we're back to the beginning. The 2nd of January 1492, in the shadow of the Alhambra, the keys changed hands. 781 years closed. The Crescent fell. The cross rose. Spain was whole. At least, that's what they told themselves. Now, here's the honest receipt we owe you. To tell the story cleanly, this piece has skipped over at least the following. First, the word Reconquista itself was invented much later. There was no unified Spain executing a single 800-year plan. Framing this history as one continuous line from Pelagius to Granada is a product of 19th-century nationalist historiography. Communities like our Bad History are full of critiques of that continuous narrative. I've tried to pull it apart in the text, but as long as I use the Reconquista framework at all, I'm inevitably riding along with it a little. Second, I've glossed over convivencia, the centuries-long coexistence of Muslims, Christians, and Jews. It's far more complicated than enemies turned lovers. There was genuine cultural exchange and prosperity, but also discrimination, the jizya tax, and periodic waves of violence and expulsion. Neither side deserves to be whitewashed as a paradise of tolerance, nor simplified into pure oppression. That tension alone is enough for an entire episode. Third, a lot of the dramatic details are legend has it level. Tariq burning his ships, that no retreat speech, exactly how Roderick died. The sources either contradict each other or are clearly later embellishments. I've tried to flag them with legend has it and according to the chronicles, but whenever you read a precise number or a dramatic quote, assume a layer of uncertainty. And one more thing I can't let slide. 1492, that same year, meant something far darker for the Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. Once the city keys were handed over, the Inquisition, forced conversions, and mass expulsions followed. Spain became whole is one side of the coin. The other side is thousands of ordinary people losing their homes. That's not a punchline nor a happy ending. If you want to dig deeper, start from two angles. First, the historiographical debate about how the Reconquista concept was constructed. Search for the myth, invention of the Reconquista. Second, the social history of al-Andalus and the scholarly debates around convivencia. Take this piece as a door, not a destination. Here's a coincidence that sends a shiver down your spine. The same year those keys changed hands, 1492, a certain Italian sailor named Christopher Columbus, sailing under those same Catholic monarchs, headed west across the ocean. He carried with him the same fire that had burned in Iberia for 8 centuries. The justification of conquest, the religious mission, the appetite for infidel lands, and the whole grammar that turned violence into holy duty. That machine did not shut off when the Reconquista ended. It just turned in a new direction, ready to burn across the Americas. Next time, we'll dismantle that. How a logic of conquest honed over 800 years on one peninsula was lifted wholesale onto ships and carried across a much wider sea to rewrite the fate of another continent. If you want to see medieval Europe as more than knights, castles, and plague, hit follow. Next time we keep prying open the power mechanisms hidden in history's fine print.